Read by Joe Jameson. Chapter 1. Not more than 5 days after she had dispatched an urgent missive to her brother, the Most Honourable the Marquis of Alverstoke, requesting him to visit her at his earliest convenience, the widowed Lady Buxted was relieved to learn from her youngest daughter that Uncle Vernon had just driven up to the house, wearing a coat with dozens of capes, and looking as fine as fivepence.
"In a smart new curricle too, Mamma, and everything prime about him,"
declared Miss Kitty, flattening her nose against the window pane in her effort to squint down into the street.
"He is the most tremendous swell, isn't he, Mamma?"
Lady Buxted responded in repressive accents, desiring her not to use expressions unbefitting a lady of quality, and dismissing her to the schoolroom. Lady Buxted was not one of her brother's admirers, and the intelligence that he had driven himself to Grosvenor Place in his coracle did nothing to advance him in her good graces. It was a fine spring morning, but a sharp wind was blowing, and no one who knew him could suppose that the Marquis would keep his high-bred horses waiting for more than a few minutes. This did not augur well for the scheme she had in mind, not as she had bitterly observed to her elder sister that she cherished any but the gloomiest expectations, Alverstoke being, without exception, the most selfish, disobliging creature alive. To this proposition, Lady Jevington, a commanding matron on the shady side of 40, lent only qualified support. She might, and did, think her only brother selfish and disobliging, but she could perceive no reason why he should be expected to do more for Louisa than for herself. As for Louisa's 2 sons and 3 daughters, Lady Jevington found herself unable to blame Alverstoke for taking no interest in any of them. It was really impossible to be interested in such commonplace children. That he was equally uninterested in her own offspring did, however, argue a selfish disposition. Anyone would have supposed that a bachelor who was not only of the first stair, but who was also possessed of considerable wealth, would have been only too glad to have sponsored such a promising nephew as her beloved Gregory into the select circle which he himself adorned, and to have exerted himself to have brought dear Anna into fashion. That Anna had become eligibly betrothed without the least assistance from him in no way mitigated her ladyship's resentment, and although she admitted the justice of her unfashionable lord's reminder that she disapproved of the frippery set to which Alverstoke belonged, and had frequently expressed the hope that Gregory would never allow himself to be drawn into it, she still could not forgive Alverstoke for having made no attempt to do so. She said that she wouldn't have cared a rush if she had not good reason to suppose that Alverstoke had not only purchased a cornetcy in the Life Guards for his young cousin and heir, but made a handsome allowance into the bargain, to which Lord Jevington replied that as he was very well able to provide for his son, who in any event had no claim whatsoever upon his uncle, he could only give Alverstoke credit for having enough good sense to refrain from making an offer of monetary assistance, which would have been deeply resented by the Honourable Gregory Sandridge's parents. This was perfectly true, but still Lady Jevington felt that if Alverstoke had had a grain of proper feeling, he would not have singled out for his favour a mere cousin instead of his eldest nephew. She also felt that in a better organised state of society, his eldest sister's son, rather than a removed cousin, would have been his heir. Without wishing to see Gregory so unfairly elevated, Lady Buxted was in general agreement with her sister, both ladies being united in contempt of Mr. Endymion Dawntree, whom they stigmatised as a perfect block. But whether their enmity towards this blameless young man arose from their dislike of his widowed mamma, or from his handsome countenance and magnificent physique, which cast both Gregory Sandridge and young Lord Buxted into the shade, was a question no one cared to ask. Whatever might have been the reason, his 2 elder sisters were convinced that no unworthier heir to Alverstoke's dignities than Endymion could have been found, and neither had spared any pains to introduce to her brother's notice all the prettiest and most eligible damsels who were fired off year after year into the ton. But Alverstoke's besetting sin was a tendency to become rapidly bored. It had vanquished his sisters, for although neither of them could suppose, reviewing the numerous dazzling barques of frailty who had lived under his protection, that he was impervious to feminine charms, neither was so mutton-headed as to indulge optimism very far when he seemed to be developing a tendre for some diamond of birth, beauty, and fortune thrust under his nose by one or other of his sisters. He was perfectly capable of making the lady the object of his gallantry for a few weeks, and then of veering off at a tangent, forgetting her very existence. When it was borne in upon his sisters that prudent parents looked askance at him, and that he was generally thought to be dangerous, they abandoned their attempts to provide him with a wife, devoting their energies instead to the easier task of deploring his indolence, condemning his selfishness, and scolding him for any of his moral aberrations which came to their ears. Only his youngest sister refrained, but as she had refused several flattering offers for her hand, and had married, to please herself, a mere country gentleman, and rarely visited the metropolis, she was considered by her two sisters to be a negligible quantity. If they spoke of her, which they seldom did, it was as poor Eliza, and although they knew that Alverstoke preferred her to themselves, it entered neither of their heads to solicit her help in the matter of his marriage. Had it done so, they would have dismissed the idea, in the well-founded belief that no one had ever, since he grew to manhood, exercised the smallest influence over him. It was not to read him a lecture that Lady Buxted had, on this occasion, commanded him to visit her. Indeed, she had resolved to say nothing that could set up his back. But as she awaited his entrance, the hope which, despite experience, had entered her breast upon hearing of his arrival was succeeded by the reflection that it was just like him to have allowed 5 days to elapse before putting himself to the trouble of answering a summons, which, for anything he knew, might have been of the utmost urgency. It was with difficulty that she schooled her countenance to an expression of affectionate welcome, and with still more difficulty that she infused cordiality into her voice when he strolled, unannounced, into the room. That was just like him too, the sort of casual behaviour which her ladyship, a high stickler, much deplored, seeing no reason why he should treat her house as if it were his own. Smothering her annoyance, she stretched out her hand, saying,
"Vernon, my dear, what a delightful surprise."
"What's surprising about it?" he inquired, lifting his black brows. "Didn't you ask me to come?" The smile remained pinned to Lady Buxted's lips, but she replied with more than a touch of acidity.
"To be sure I did, but so many days ago that I supposed you had gone out of town."
"Oh, no," he said, returning her smile with one of great sweetness. Lady Buxted was not deceived, but thought it prudent to ignore what she recognised as deliberate provocation. She patted the sofa and invited her brother to come and sit down. Instead of doing this, he walked forward to the fireplace and bent to warm his hands, saying, "I can't stay for long, Louisa. What is it you want of me?" Having made up her mind to lead up to her request by tactful degrees, she found this blunt question as infuriating as it was disconcerting. She hesitated, and he glanced up, a gleam in his rather hard grey eyes, and said, "Well?" She was not immediately obliged to answer him, for at that moment her butler came in, with such refreshments as he considered suitable to the occasion. While he set the heavy tray down on a side table, and informed the Marquis in the confidential voice of the privileged retainer that he had ventured to bring up the mountain as well as the sherry, she had time in which to reassemble her ideas, and also to observe, in some dudgeon, that her brother had chosen to visit her in breeches and top boots, attire as regrettably informal as his entrance. That his boots were highly polished, his neckcloth arranged to a nicety, and his coat, which fitted him like a glove, clearly cut by a master, only served to increase her displeasure. She felt that if his general indifference had extended to his appearance, she could have forgiven him for not thinking it necessary to honour her by assuming the correct dress for paying morning visits. But no one who looked as elegant as he invariably did, or whose style was copied by so many gentlemen of fashion, could possibly be indifferent to matters of mode. Indeed, she had once demanded, in a moment of exasperation, if he cared for anything but his clothing, to which he had replied, after subjecting the question to consideration, that although his clothes were naturally of paramount importance, he also cared for his horses. He had gone across the room to the side table, and as the butler withdrew, he turned his head, saying, "Sherry, Louisa?"
"My dear Vernon, you should surely know by now that I never touch sherry."
"Should I? But I have such a shockingly bad memory."
"Not when you wish to remember anything."
Oh no, not then, he agreed. He looked across at her, and at sight of her tightened lips and rising colour, laughed suddenly. What a chucklehead you are, dear sister. I never yet cast my line over a fish that rose more readily to the fly than you do. What is it to be? The Malaga?
I will take half a glass of ratafia, if you will be so good as to pour it out for me,
she answered stiffly. It does considerable violence to my feelings, but I will be so good. What an appalling thing to drink at this hour. Or indeed, at any hour, he added reflectively. He brought the glass to her, moving in his leisurely way, but with the grace of the born athlete. Now, what is it this time? Don't beat about the bush. I don't want my horses to take cold.
I wish you will sit down, she said crossly.
Very well, but do for God's sake cut line, he replied, choosing an armchair on the opposite side of the fireplace.
It so happens, Alverstoke, that I do desire your assistance, she said.
That, dear Louisa, I apprehended when I read your letter, he retorted, with horrid affability. Of course you might have summoned me to stun me with one of your rake-downs, but you couched your missive in such affectionate language that suspicion was banished almost instantly from my mind, leaving me with the only alternative, that you wanted me to do something for you.
I should be grateful, I collect, that you remembered that I had written to ask you to visit me, she said, glaring at him.
Well, you can't think, Louisa, how strongly tempted I am to accept your gratitude with a becoming smirk, he told her. But never shall it be said of me that I stole another man's honours. Trevor gave me the office.
Do you mean to tell me that Mr. Trevor read my letter? Demanded Lady Buxted indignantly. Your secretary?
I employ him to read my letters, explained his lordship.
Not those written by your nearest and dearest.
Oh no, not them, he agreed. Her bosom swelled.
You are the most
She stopped, with a gasp, visibly wrought with herself, and contrived, by a heroic effort, to force the smile back to her lips, and to say, with a tolerable assumption of amusement,
Wretch, I shan't allow you to take a rise out of me. I want to talk to you about Jane.
Who the devil is... Oh yes, I know. One of your girls.
My eldest daughter. And let me remind you, your niece, Alverstoke.
Unjust, Louisa. I needed no reminder.
I am bringing the dear child out this season, she announced, ignoring the interpolation. I shall present her, of course, at one of the drawing rooms, if the Queen holds any more, but they say her health is now so indifferent that...
You'll have to do something about her freckles, if she's the one I think she is, he interrupted. Have you tried citron water?
I didn't invite you to come here to discuss Jane's appearance, she snapped.
Well, why did you invite me?
To ask you to hold a ball in her honour, at Alverstoke House, she disclosed, rushing her fence.
To do what?
I know very well what you are going to say, but only consider, Vernon. She is your niece, and what place could be more suitable for her come-out ball than Alverstoke House?
This house, he responded, without hesitation.
Oh, don't be so disagreeable. I am persuaded they could not dance above 30 couples in this room, and only think of all the fuss and botheration.
I am thinking of it, said his lordship.
But there can be no comparison. I mean here, where I should be obliged to remove all the furniture from my drawing room, besides using the dining room for supper and the parlour for the ladies' cloaks, and Alverstoke House, where there is such a splendid ballroom. And it is my own old home, too.
It is also my home, said the Marquis. My memory is occasionally faulty, but I retain the liveliest recollection of what you so rightly termed the fuss and botheration that attended the balls given there for Augusta, for yourself, and for Eliza, and my answer, dear sister, is no.
Have you no proper feeling? She said, tragically.
He had drawn an enamel snuff-box from his pocket, and was critically studying the painting on its lid. No, none at all. I wonder if I made a mistake when I purchased this. I liked it at the time, but I begin to find it a trifle insipid. He sighed and opened the box, with a practised flick of his thumb. and I most assuredly do not like this mixture, he said, inhaling an infinitesimal pinch and dusting his fingers with an expression of distaste. You will say, of course, that I should have known better than to have permitted Mendlesham to thrust his sort upon me, and you are perfectly right. One should always mix one's own. He got up. Well, if that's all, I'll take my leave of you.
It is not all,
she uttered, her colour much heightened.
I knew how it would be, of course. Oh, I knew.
I imagine you might. But why the devil you wasted my time?
Because I hoped that for once in your life you might show some sensibility, some apprehension of what is due to your family, even some affection for poor Jane.
Rainbow-chasing, Louisa. My lack of sensibility has distressed you for years. I haven't the least affection for your poor Jane, whom I should be hard put to it to recognise if I met her unawares, and I've yet to learn that the Buxteds are members of my family.
Am I not a member of your family?
She demanded.
Do you forget that I am your sister?
No, I've never been granted the opportunity to forget it. Oh, don't fly off the hooks again. You can have no notion how bracket-faced you look when you get into one of your pelters. Console yourself with my assurance that if Buxted had left you purse-pinched, I should have felt myself obliged to let you hang on my sleeve. He looked mockingly down at her. Yes, I know you're about to tell me that you haven't sixpence to scratch with, but the plain truth is that you are very well-to-do in the world, my dear Louisa, but the most unconscionable pinch-penny of my acquaintance. Now, don't nauseate me by prating of affection. You've no more for me than I have for you. Considerably disconcerted by this direct attack, she stammered,
How can you say so, when I am sure I have always been most sincerely attached to you?
You deceive yourself, sister. Not to me, but to my purse.
Oh, how can you be so unjust? And as for my being well-to-do in the world, I dare say that you, with your reckless extravagance, would be astonished to learn that I am obliged to exercise the strictest economy. Why, pray, do you imagine that I removed from our beautiful house in Albemarle Street when Buxted died, and came to live in this out-of-the-way place? He smiled.
Since there was not the least occasion for that removal, I can only suppose that it was from your incurable love of sconcing the reckoning.
If you mean that I was obliged to reduce my expenses—
No, merely that you were unable to resist the temptation to do so.
With 5 children left on my hands—
She broke off, warned by the quizzical look in his eye that it would be unwise to develop this theme. Just so, he said, sympathetically. I think we had better part, don't you?
Sometimes,
said Lady Buxted, with suppressed passion.
I think you must be the most odious, unnatural creature that ever drew breath. No doubt if it had been Endymion who had applied to you, you would have been all compliance.
These bitter words appeared powerfully to affect the Marquis, but after a stunned moment he pulled himself together and recommended his sister, in faint but soothing accents, to retire to bed with a paregoric draught. For you are sadly out of curl, Louisa, believe me. Do let me assure you that if ever Endymion should ask me to give a ball in his honour, I shall take steps to have him placed under restraint.
Oh, how detestable you are, she exclaimed. You know very well I didn't mean— that what I meant— that—
No, don't explain it to me, he interrupted. It is quite unnecessary, I promise you. I perfectly understand you. Indeed, I've done so for years. You— and I rather fancy Augusta, too, have persuaded yourself that I have a strong partiality for Endymion.
That moonling!
You are too severe. Merely a slow top.
Yes, we all know that you think him a positive pattern card of perfection,
she said, angrily, kneading her handkerchief between her hands. He had been idly swinging his quizzing glass on the end of its long riband, but was moved by this interjection to raise the glass to one eye, the better to survey his sister's inflamed countenance. What a very odd interpretation to put upon my words, he remarked.
Don't tell me,
retorted Lady Buxted in full career.
Whatever your precious Endymion wants, he may have for the asking, while your sisters—
I hesitate to interrupt you, Louisa, murmured his lordship untruthfully. But I think that extremely doubtful. I'm not at all benevolent, you know.
And you don't make him an allowance, I collect, "Oh, no, indeed."
"So that's what's wound you up, is it? What a very hubble-bubble creature you are. At one moment you revile me for behaving scaley to my family, and at the next you come to cuffs with me for honouring my obligations to my heir."
"That block!"
she ejaculated.
"If he is to become the head of the family, I shan't be able to bear it."
"Well, don't put yourself into a taking on that score," he recommended. "Very likely you won't be obliged to bear it, for the chances are that you'll predecease me. I can give you 5 years, you know." Lady Buxted, unable to find words adequate to the occasion, sought refuge in a burst of tears, reproaching her brother between sobs for his unkindness. But if she thought to soften his heart by these tactics, she was the more mistaken. Amongst the many things which bored him, feminine tears and recriminations ranked high. Saying, with unconvincing solicitude, that if he had guessed that she was out of sorts, he would not have inflicted his presence on her, he took his leave, sped on his way by the fervently expressed hope of his sister that she would at least live to see him come by his deserts. She stopped crying as soon as the door shut behind the Marquis, and might have recovered some degree of equanimity, had not her eldest son chosen to come into the room a few minutes later to ask her, with a sad want of tact, whether his uncle had been visiting her, and if so, what he had had to say to her proposal. Upon learning from her that Alverstoke had been as disobliging as she had always known he would be, he looked grave, but said that he could not be sorry, for, having thought the matter over carefully, he could not like the scheme. Lady Buxted's disposition was not a loving one. She was quite as selfish as her brother, and far less honest, for she neither acknowledged nor indeed recognised her shortcomings. She had long since convinced herself that her life was one long sacrifice to her fatherless children, and by the simple expedients of prefixing the names of her 2 sons and 3 daughters by doting epithets, speaking of them, though not invariably to them, in caressing accents, and informing the world at large that she had no thought or ambition that was not centred on her offspring, she contrived to figure, in the eyes of the uncritical majority, as a devoted parent. Of her children, Carlton, whom she rather too frequently alluded to as her firstborn, was her favourite. He had never caused her to feel a moment's anxiety. From being a stolid little boy, accepting his mamma at her own valuation, he had grown into a worthy young man, with a deep sense of his responsibilities, and a serious turn of mind which not only kept him out of the scrapes into which his livelier cousin Gregory fell, but which made it quite impossible for him to understand what Gregory, or any other of his contemporaries, found to amuse them in their larks and revel routs. His understanding was moderate, and his processes of thought as slow as they were painstaking, but he was not at all conceited, merely priding himself on his common sense. Nor was he jealous of George, his younger brother, whose intelligence he knew to be superior to his own. He was, in fact, proud of George, thinking him a very needle-witted boy. And although his lucubrations had shown him that such ardent spirits as George's might well lead that promising youth from the path of virtue, he never divulged this apprehension to his mother, or informed her of his intention to keep a watchful eye on George when George's schooldays came to an end. He neither confided in her nor argued with her, and not even to his sister Jane had he ever uttered a word of criticism of her. He was 24 years of age, but as he had as yet shown no disposition to assert himself, it came as an unpleasant surprise to his mother when he said that he knew of no reason why Jane's come-out ball should be held at his uncle's house, and at his expense. He sank rapidly in her affection, and, her temper being already exacerbated, they might soon have been at dagger-drawing, if he had not prudently withdrawn from the engagement. He was grieved to discover presently that Jane partook of her mother's sentiments upon this occasion, asserting that it was detestable of Uncle Vernon to be so disobliging, and so hard-fisted as to begrudge the expenditure of a few £100.
"I am persuaded, Jane," said Buxted gravely, "that you have too much propriety of taste to wish to be so much beholden to my uncle." "Oh, fiddle-faddle!" she exclaimed angrily. "Pray, why shouldn't I be beholden to him? I'm sure it's no more than his duty, after all."
His upper lip seemed to lengthen, as it always did when he was displeased. He said, in a repressive voice, "I make every allowance for your disappointment, but I venture to think that you will find a party here, in your own home, very much more enjoyable than a vast rout at Alverstoke House,
where more than half the guests, I dare say, would be quite unknown to you."
His second sister, Maria, who with her own come-out in view was quite as indignant as Jane, was unable to contain herself, but barely waited for him to come to the end of his measured speech before demanding why he talked such gammon.
"More enjoyable to hold a nip-farthing ball here, with no more than 50 persons invited, than to make her first appearance at Alverstoke House? You must be all about in your head," she told his lordship. "It will be the shabbiest affair, for you know what Mamma is. But if my uncle were to give a ball, only think how magnificent it would be. Hundreds of guests, and all of the first consequence. Lobsters, and aspic jellies, and chantillies, and creams." "Invited to the ball,"
interpolated Carlton, with ponderous humour.
"And champagne,"
struck in Jane, paying no heed to him.
"And I should have stood at the head of the great staircase, with Mamma and my uncle, in a white satin gown, trimmed with rosebuds and pink gauze, and a wreath."
This beautiful vision caused tears to well into her eyes, but failed to arouse enthusiasm in either Maria or in Carlton, Maria objecting that with her freckles and sandy hair, she would look like a quiz. And Carlton saying that he wondered at it that his sister should think so much of worldly trumpery. Neither thought it worthwhile to reply to this. But when he added that for his part he was glad Alverstoke had refused to give the ball, they were quite as much incensed as had been their mamma, and far more vociferous. So he went away, leaving his sisters to deplore his prosiness, quarrel about rosebuds and pink gauze, and agree that, while their uncle was detestable, it was probably mamma's fault for setting up his back, which neither damsel doubted for an instant that she had done. Chapter 2. When the Marquis entered his house some time later, one of the first things that his eyes alighted on was a letter, lying on one of a pair of ebony and ormolu pier tables. Its direction was written in large and flourishing characters, and the pale blue wafer which sealed it was unbroken, Mr. Charles Trevor, the Marquis's excellent secretary, having recognised at a glance that it emanated from one or other of the frail beauties temporarily engaging his lordship's erratic attention. Relinquishing his hat, his gloves, and the lavishly caped driving coat which had excited Miss Kitty Buxted's admiration into the hands of the footman waiting to receive them, he picked up the letter and strolled with it into the library. As he broke the wafer and spread open the crossed sheet, an aroma of ambergris assailed his fastidious nostrils. An expression of distaste came into his face. He held the letter at arm's length and groped for his quizzing glass. Through this he scanned the missive in a cursory way, before dropping it into the fire. Fanny, he decided, was becoming an intolerable bore. A dazzling creature, but, like so many prime articles, she was never satisfied. She now wanted a pair of cream-coloured horses to draw her barouche. Last week it had been a diamond necklace. He had given her that, and it would serve for a farewell gift. The sickly scent with which she had sprinkled her letter seemed to linger on his fingers. He was carefully wiping them when Charles Trevor came into the room. He glanced up, and seeing the look of surprise on that young gentleman's face, very kindly explained to him that he disliked ambergris. Mr. Trevor offered no comment, but comprehension was writ so large upon his face that Alverstoke said, "Just so. I know what you are thinking, Charles, and you are perfectly right. It is time I gave the fair Fanny her congé." He sighed. "A nice bit of game, but as bird-witted as she's avaricious." Again Mr. Trevor offered no comment. He would have been hard put to it to have made one, for his thoughts on the delicate subject were tangled. As a moralist, he could only deplore his employer's way of life. As one deeply imbued with chivalrous ideals, he pitied the fair Fanny. But as one who was fully aware of the extent of his lordship's generosity towards the lady, he was obliged to own that she had no cause for complaint. Charles Trevor, one of the younger members of a large family, owed his present position to the circumstance of his father's having been appointed, when newly ordained, to the post of tutor and general mentor to the present Marquis's father, accompanying him on a protracted grand tour. A comfortable living was not his only reward. His noble pupil remained sincerely attached to him, stood as godfather to his eldest son, and reared his own son in the vague belief that the Reverend Lawrence Trevor had a claim upon his patronage. So, when the Reverend Lawrence had ventured to suggest to the present Marquis that Charles was a suitable candidate for the post of secretary, Alverstoke had accepted him with far more readiness than Charles had felt in becoming a member of his household. Charles had no desire to enter the church, but he was a young man of serious mind and unimpeachable morals, and nothing he had heard of Alverstoke led him to expect that his appointment would prove to be anything but a mortification of the flesh. But as he had, besides common sense, a good deal of filial affection, and knew that to a clergyman of moderate substance it was no easy task to provide for a sixth son, he kept his misgivings to himself, assured his father that he would do his best not to disappoint his expectations, and derived what consolation he could from the reflection that when he was an inmate of Alverstoke House, he must surely find it easier to discover and to grasp a golden opportunity than while he kicked his heels in a country parsonage. Since his taste ran to politics, the golden opportunity had not so far offered itself, the Marquis not sharing his ambition, and consequently making infrequent appearances in the upper house. But he was allowed to write such brief speeches as his patron felt that it behoved him to utter, and even, now and then, to favour him with his own political convictions. Furthermore, he had found it quite impossible to dislike Alverstoke. While he was given no reason to suppose that Alverstoke was interested in his concerns, he found him to be as unexacting as he was amiable, and never disagreeably high in the instep. Comparing notes with a college friend, in a similar situation, whose employer appeared to regard him as a cross between a black slave and an upper servant, Charles knew himself to be fortunate. Alverstoke could give an annihilating snub to some encroaching mushroom, but if his secretary erred, he raked him down in a manner which was unexceptionable, since it conveyed no suggestion of social superiority. Charles's friend had curt commands flung at him. Charles received civil requests, generally accompanied by one of his lordship's more attractive smiles. Try as Charles would, he could not resist Alverstoke's charm, any more than he could withhold admiration for his horsemanship and his proficiency in a great many sporting activities. "I collect," said the Marquis, faint amusement in his eyes, "from your hesitant air and sheepish demeanour, that you feel it to be your duty to put me in mind of yet another obligation. Take my advice and don't do it. I shall take it very unkind in you, and very likely fly up into the bows." A grin dispelled the gravity of Mr. Trevor's countenance. "You never do, sir," he said simply, "and it isn't an obligation. At least, I don't think it is. Only I thought you would like to know of it." "Oh, did you? In my experience, whenever those words are uttered, they are the prelude to something I would liefer not know." "Yes," said Mr. Trevor, ingenuously. "But I wish you will read this letter. As a matter of fact, I promised Miss Merriville that you would." "And who," demanded his lordship, "is Miss Merriville?" "She said you would know, sir." "Really, Charles, you should know me better than to suppose that I carry in my head the names of all the—" He stopped, his brows drawing together. "Merriville," he repeated thoughtfully. "I believe, sir, some sort of connection of yours?" "A very remote sort. What the devil does she want?" Mr. Trevor offered him a sealed letter. He took it, but said severely, "You would be very well served if I put it into the fire and left you to explain how it was that you were not, after all, able to see to it that I read it." He broke the seal and opened the letter. It did not take him long to master its contents. He raised his eyes when he came to the end, and directed a look of pained inquiry at Mr. Trevor. "Are you a trifle out of sorts, Charles? On the Toodle last night, and not feeling quite the thing today?" "No, of course not," said Mr. Trevor, shocked. "Well, what in heaven's name has made you suddenly queer in your attic?" "I'm not. I mean, you must be. Never before, in the 3 years of our association, have you failed to make my excuses to my more importunate relatives. As for encouraging the dirty dishes amongst them, that I am persuaded they are not, sir. I fancy they may not be affluent, but—" "Dirty dishes," repeated his lordship firmly. "When one considers that my sister believes herself to be living quite out of the world in Grosvenor Place, what can one think of persons owning to Upper Wimpole Street? And if—" he glanced down at the letter again, "and if this F. Merriville is the daughter of the only member of the family with whom I ever had the slightest acquaintance, you may depend upon it she hasn't a souse, and hopes I may be so obliging as to remedy this." No, Mr. Trevor said. I hope I know better than to encourage such persons as that."
"So do I,"
agreed his lordship. He lifted a quizzical eyebrow.
"Friends of yours, Charles?"
"I never saw them before in my life, sir," replied Mr. Trevor stiffly. "I should perhaps assure your lordship that I should consider it grossly improper to try to introduce any of my friends to your notice."
"Well, don't poker up about it. I really didn't mean to insult you,"
said Alverstoke mildly. "No, sir, of course not," Mr. Trevor said, mollified. "I beg pardon. The thing is, well, I had best explain to you how it came about that I did meet Miss Merriville."
"Do,"
invited Alverstoke. "She brought the letter herself," disclosed Mr. Trevor. "The carriage drew up just as I was about to enter the house. You see, you gave me very little to do today, so I thought you wouldn't object to it if I went out to purchase some new neckcloths for myself."
"Now, what can have put such an idea as that into your head?"
Another grin was drawn from his staid secretary. "You did, sir. Well, the long and short of it is that Miss Merriville got down from the carriage, the letter in her hand, as I was mounting the steps. So—"
"Ah,"
interpolated Alverstoke.
"No footman. Probably a job carriage."
"As to that, sir, I don't know. At all events, I asked her if I could be of service, telling her that I was your secretary, and we fell into conversation, and I said that I would give you her letter, and, well—"
"See to it that I read it," supplied Alverstoke. "Describe this charmer to me, Charles."
"Miss Merriville," said Mr. Trevor, apparently at a loss. "Well, I didn't notice her particularly, sir. She was very civil and unaffected and certainly not what you call a dirty dish. I mean—"
He paused, trying to conjure up a picture of Miss Merriville.
"Well, I don't know much about such things, but it seemed to me that she was dressed with elegance. Quite young, I think, though not in her first season, or even," he added reflectively, "in her second season." He drew a long breath and uttered, in reverent accents, "It was the other one, sir."
"Yes,"
said Alverstoke encouragingly, the amusement deepening in his eyes. Mr. Trevor seemed to find it difficult to express himself, but after a pause, during which he obviously conjured up a heavenly vision, he said earnestly, "Sir, I have never before seen, or even dreamed of such a lovely girl. Her eyes, so big and of such a blue. Her hair like shining gold. The prettiest little nose, too, and her complexion quite exquisite. And when she spoke—"
"But what were her ankles like?"
interrupted his lordship. Mr. Trevor blushed and laughed. "I didn't see her ankles, sir, for she remained in the carriage. I was particularly struck by the sweetness of her expression and her soft voice. In fact, there is something very taking about her, if you know what I mean."
"I have a very fair notion."
"Yes, well, when she leaned forward and smiled and begged me to give the letter to you, I promised her I would do so, even though I knew you wouldn't be above half pleased."
"You wrong me, Charles. I confess you haven't aroused the smallest desire in me to make Miss Merriville's acquaintance, but I must certainly meet her companion. Who, by the way, is she?"
"I am not perfectly sure, sir, but I fancy she might be Miss Merriville's sister, though she is not at all like her. Miss Merriville called her Carris."
"Well, that confirms me in my dislike of Miss Merriville. Of all abominable abbreviations, I think Carrie the most repulsive."
No, expostulated Mr. Trevor. "You misunderstood me, sir. Of course it isn't Carrie. Miss Merriville distinctly said Carris, and I thought that never was anyone more aptly named, for it means grace, you know, from the Greek."
"Thank you, Charles," said his lordship meekly. "Where should I be without you?"
"I thought you might have forgotten, sir, your memory being so bad." The Marquis acknowledged this demure hit by lifting one of his strong, slender hands in a fencer's gesture.
"Very well, Charles. Damn your impudence."
Encouraged, Mr. Trevor said, "Miss Merriville said she hoped you would call in Upper Wimpole Street." "Sir, will you?"
"I dare say. If you can assure me that I shall find the beautiful Caris there."
Mr. Trevor was unable to do this, but he knew better than to urge the matter further, and withdrew, not unhopeful of the issue. Thinking it over later, it occurred to him that in exposing Caris to Alverstoke's destructive notice, he might be doing her a vast disservice. He was not afraid that Alverstoke would try to seduce a gently born female of tender years, however beautiful she might be. His lordship's gallantries did not include such wanton acts as that. But he did fear that he might, if Caris captured his fancy, lure her into one of his assuivi flirtations, bestowing a flattering degree of attention upon her, and perhaps leading her to think that he had formed a lasting passion for her. Remembering Caris's melting look and appealing smile, Mr. Trevor felt that her heart could easily be broken, and his conscience smote him. Then he reflected that she could hardly be alone in the world, and decided that her protection from a notorious flirt might safely be left to her parents. Besides, very young females ranked high on the list of the things Alverstoke rated as dead bores. As for Miss Merriville, Mr. Trevor felt that she was very well able to take care of herself. He had been dazzled by her beautiful companion, but he retained a vague impression of a self-possessed female, with a slightly aquiline nose and an air of friendly assurance. He did not think that she would be easily taken in. Further reflection convinced him that no attempt would be made to trifle with her affections. It was unlikely that so noted a connoisseur of beauty as Alverstoke would deem her worthy of a second glance. In fact, it was even more unlikely that he would in any way bestir himself on her behalf. After several days, during which his lordship made no mention of her, and certainly did not go to pay her a morning call, it began to seem as though he had either decided to ignore her or had forgotten her existence. Mr. Trevor knew that it was his duty to remind him, but he refrained, feeling that the moment was unpropitious. His lordship had been obliged to endure 3 visits, 2 from his elder sisters and 1 from his heir's widowed mother, all of which had bored him so much that every member of his household took great pains not to put him out of temper.
"For I assure you, Mr. Wickham," said his lordship's top lofty valet, condescending to his lordship's butler, "that when he is nettled, his lordship can create quite a curmudgeon, as they say."
"I am well aware of that, Mr. Knapp," returned his colleague, "being as I have been acquainted with his lordship from his cradle. He reminds me of his father, the late lord, but you of course didn't know him," he added, depressing pretension.
His lordship had indeed been sorely tried. Lady Buxted, never one to accept defeat, had come to Alverstoke House on the flimsiest of pretexts, accompanied by her eldest daughter, who, failing to soften her uncle's heart by cajolery, had dissolved into tears. But as she was not one of those few fortunate females who could cry without rendering themselves hideous, he was as impervious to her tears as to his sister's account of the straitened circumstances to which she had been reduced. Only penury, Lady Buxted declared, had compelled her to apply to her brother for his assistance in the all-important duty of launching her dearest Jane into the temps. But her brother, speaking with the utmost amiability, told her that parsimony, not penury, was the correct word, upon which her ladyship lost her temper, and gave him what James, the first footman, who was waiting in the hall, described to his immediate subordinate as a rare bear-garden jaw. Mrs. Dawntree was his lordship's second visitor. Like Lady Buxted, she was a widow, and she shared her cousin's conviction that it was Alverstoke's bounden duty to provide for her offspring. There the resemblance between them ended. Lady Buxted was frequently designated, by the vulgar, as a hatchet, but no one could have applied such a term to Mrs. Dawntree, who presented an appearance of extreme fragility, and bore with noble fortitude all the trials which beset her. As a girl, she had been an accredited beauty, but a tendency to succumb to infectious complaints had encouraged her to believe that her constitution was sickly, and it was not long after her marriage that she began, as Lady Jevington and Lady Buxted unkindly phrased it, to quack herself. Her husband's untimely demise had set the seal on her ill health. She became the subject of nervous disorders, and embarked on a series of cures and diets which, since they included such melancholy remedies as goat's whey, for an imagined consumption, soon reduced her to wraith-like proportions. By the time she was 40, she had become so much addicted to invalidism that unless some attractive entertainment was offered her, she spent the better part of her days reclining gracefully upon a sofa, with a poor relation in attendance, and a table beside her crowded with bottles and phials which contained cinnamon water, valerian, asafoetida drops, camphorated spirits of lavender, and any other paregoric or restorative recommended to her by friends or by the maker's advertisement. Unlike Lady Buxted, she was neither ill-tempered nor hard-fisted. She had a faint, plaintive voice which, when she was thwarted, merely became fainter and more exhausted. And she was as ready to squander fortunes upon her children as upon herself. Unfortunately, her jointure, described by the ladies Jevington and Buxted as an easy competence, was not large enough to enable her to live, without management and economy, in the style to which, she said, she was accustomed. And as she was too invalidish to study these arts, she was forever outrunning the constable. She had been Alverstoke's pensioner for years, and although heaven knew how much she wished to be independent of his generosity, she could not but feel that since her handsome son was his heir, it was his duty to provide also for her 2 daughters. As the elder of these, Miss Chloe Dauntrey was some weeks short of her 17th birthday. Her presentation had not exercised Mrs. Dauntrey's mind until she learned, from various garbled sources, that Alverstoke was planning to give a magnificent ball in honour of Miss Jane Buxted. A weak female she might be, but in defence of her beloved children she declared she could become a lioness. In this guise she descended upon Alverstoke, armed with her most powerful weapon, her vinaigrette. She made no demands, for that was not her way. When he entered the saloon, she came towards him, trailing shawls and draperies, and holding out her hands, which were exquisitely gloved in lavender kid.
"Dear Alverstoke," she uttered, raising huge sunken eyes to his face, and bestowing one of her wistful smiles upon him. "My kind benefactor, how can I thank you?"
Wholly ignoring her left hand, he briefly clasped the other, saying, "Thank me for what?"
"So like you,"
she murmured.
"But although you may forget your generosity, I cannot. Oh, I am quite in disgrace with poor Harriet and the girls for venturing out of doors in such chilly weather, but I felt it was the least I could do. You are a great deal too good."
"Well, that's something new at all events," he remarked. "Sit down, Lucretia, and let me have the word with no bark on it. What have I inadvertently done to excite your gratitude?" Nothing had ever been known to disturb the saintliness of Mrs. Dauntrey's voice and demeanour. She replied, as she sank gracefully into a chair,
"Dissembler, I know you too well to be taken in. You don't like to be thanked. And indeed, if I were to thank you for all your goodness to me and mine, your never-failing support, your kindness to my loved ones, I fear I should become what you call a dead bore. Chloe, dear child, calls you our fairy godfather."
"She must be a wet goose," he responded.
"Oh, she thinks no one the equal of her magnificent cousin Alverstoke," said Mrs. Dauntrey, gently laughing. "You are quite first oars with her, I assure you."
"No need to put yourself in a worry over that," he said. "She'll recover."
"You are too naughty,"
Mrs. Dauntrey said playfully.
"You hope to circumvent me, but to no avail, I promise you. Well do you know that I am here to thank you, yes, and to scold you, for coming, as I alas could not, to Endymion's assistance. That beautiful horse, complete to a shade, he tells me. It is a great deal too good of you."
"So, that's what you came to thank me for, is it?" said his lordship, a sardonic look in his eye. "You shouldn't have ventured out on such an unnecessary errand. I said when he joined that I would keep him decently mounted."
"So generous," she sighed. "He is deeply sensible of it. As for me, I wonder sometimes what must have become of me when I was bereft of my beloved husband, if I had not been able to depend upon your support through every trial."
"My faith in you, dear cousin, leads me to believe that you would have lost no time in discovering some other support," he answered, in a voice as sweet as hers. He smiled slightly, watching her bite her lip, and said, as he opened his snuff-box, "And what is the trial at present besetting you?" She opened her eyes very wide at this, saying in a bewildered tone,
"My dear Alverstoke, what can you mean? Apart from my wretched health, and I never talk of that, you know, none at all, I've discharged my errand, and must take my leave of you before my poor Harriet begins to fancy I've suffered one of my stupid spasms. She is waiting for me in the carriage, for she wouldn't hear of my coming alone. Such good care as she takes of me. I am quite spoiled between you all."
She rose, drawing her shawl around her and putting out her hand. But before he could take it, she let it fall, exclaiming,
"Oh, that puts me in mind of something I've been wanting to discuss with you. Advise me, Alverstoke. I am quite in a quandary."
"You put me to shame, Lucretia," he said. "As often as I disappoint you, you never disappoint me."
"How you do love to joke me. Now be serious, pray. It is about Chloe."
"Oh, in that case you must hold me excused," said his lordship. "I know nothing of schoolgirls, but my advice would be worthless, I fear."
"Ah, you too think of her as a schoolgirl. Indeed, it seems almost impossible that she should be grown up. But so it is. She's all but 17, and although I had thought not to bring her out until next year, everyone tells me it would be wrong to postpone the event. They say, you know, that the dear Queen's health is now so indifferent that she may pop off at any moment, and even if she doesn't, she won't be equal to holding any drawing-rooms next year. Which has me in a worry, because naturally I must present the sweet child. It is what poor Henry would have wished, and if the Queen were to die, there can be no drawing-rooms. As for presenting her at Carlton House, I wouldn't for the world do so. I don't know how we are to go on. Even if the Duchess of Gloucester were to take the Queen's place, which of course the Prince Regent might desire her to do, for she has always been his favourite sister, it wouldn't be the same thing. And who knows but what one might find that odious Lady Hertford in the Queen's place?"
Alverstoke, who could think of few more unlikely contingencies, replied sympathetically, "Who indeed?"
"So I feel it to be my duty to present Chloe this season, whatever the cost,"
said Mrs. Dawntrey.
"I had hoped to have been so much beforehand with the world next year as to have been able to do the thing handsomely, but that, alas, can scarcely be. Dear child, when I told her that I should be obliged to present her in one of my own court dresses, because the cost of such a dress as one would wish her to wear is utterly beyond my means, she was so good and so uncomplaining that it quite went to my heart. I couldn't forbear to sigh. She is so pretty that I positively long to rig her out to the best advantage. But if I must bring her out this season, it cannot be."
"In that case, my advice to you is to wait until next year," responded Alverstoke, consoling yourself with the reflection that if there are no drawing-rooms, then none of the season's fair come-outs will enjoy an experience which is denied her.
"Oh, no, how could I be so improvident?" she countered. "Somehow I must contrive to present her this spring. A dance, too. But how to do that, situated as I am?"
She broke off, apparently struck by a sudden idea.
"I wonder if Louisa means to bring Jane out this season. Sadly freckled, poor child, and such a deplorable figure. However, you may depend upon it that Louisa will make a push to present her creditably, though she is such a nip-cheese that I am persuaded she will grudge every penny she is obliged to spend on the business. Indeed," she added, softly laughing, "rumour has it that you are to give a ball in Jane's honour."
"Yes," said his lordship, "but rumour, as I dare say you know, is a pipe, blown by surmises, jealousies, conjectures. I forget the rest. But do let me assure you, dear Lucretia, that when invitations are sent out for a ball to be held here, Chloe's name will not be forgotten. And now you must allow me to escort you to your carriage. The thought of the devoted Harriet, patiently awaiting you, is beginning to prey upon my mind."
"Stay,"
said Mrs. Dawntrey, struck by yet another idea.
"How would it be if Louisa and I cast our resources into a pool dish, as it were, and gave a ball in honour of both our daughters. I am afraid that my lovely Chloe would quite outshine poor Jane, but I dare say Louisa won't care for that, if she can but make and scrape a little."
She raised her hands in a prayerful gesture, and added, in a voice of nicely blended archness and cajolery,
"Would you, dearest Vernon, if Louisa liked the scheme, permit us to hold the ball here, in your splendid ballroom?"
"No, dearest Lucretia, I would not," replied his lordship. "But don't repine. The occasion won't arise, since Louisa wouldn't like the scheme at all, believe me. Yes, I know that I am being so abominably disobliging as to make you feel faint. Shall I summon the faithful Harriet to your side?"
This was a little too much, even for Mrs. Dawntrey. Casting upon him a deeply reproachful glance, she departed, her mien challenging comparison with that of Mrs. Siddons, as portrayed by the late Sir Joshua Reynolds as the tragic muse. The Marquis's third visitor was Lady Jevington, who came not to solicit his favour, but to adjure him not to yield to Lady Buxted's importunities. She expressed herself in measured and majestic terms, saying that while she had neither expected him to lend his aid in the launching of her Anna into the temps, nor asked him to do so, she would be unable to regard it as anything but a deliberate slight if he were to perform this office for Miss Buxted, who did not, said Lady Jevington with awful emphasis, share with her cousin the distinction of being his goddaughter. And if, she added, his partiality were to lead him to single out that woman's daughter Chloe for this particular mark of favour, she would thenceforward wash her hands of him. "Almost, Augusta, you persuade me," said his lordship. The words, spoken dulcetly, were accompanied by the sweetest of smiles. But Lady Jevington, arising in swelling wrath, swept out of the room without another word. "And now," the Marquis told his secretary, "it only remains for your protégé to demand a ball of me." Chapter 3. In the face of these experiences, it did not seem probable that the Marquis, who rarely felt it incumbent upon him to please anyone but himself, would respond to Miss Merriville's appeal. Nor did Charles Trevor venture to jog his memory. But whether from curiosity, or because he found himself one day in the vicinity of Upper Wimpole Street, he did pay her a visit. He was admitted to the house by an elderly butler, who conducted him up the narrow staircase to the drawing-room on the first floor, at a pace eloquent of age and infirmity, and announced him. The Marquis, pausing on the threshold and casting a swift look round, felt that his suspicion was confirmed. This unknown connection was demonstrably indigent, for the room was furnished without elegance, and was even a little shabby. Lacking experience, he failed to recognise the signs which would have informed less fortunately circumstanced persons that the house was one of the many hired for the season, and equipped as cheaply as possible. It contained only one occupant, a lady, writing at a small desk, placed at right angles to the window. She looked round quickly, directing at Alverstoke a gaze that was at once surprised and appraising. He saw that she was quite young, probably some 3 or 24 years of age, her person well-formed, and her countenance distinguished by a pair of candid grey eyes, a somewhat masterful little nose, and a very firm mouth and chin. Her hair, which was of a light brown, was becomingly braided à la Didon, and her gown, which she wore under a striped dress spencer, was of fine cambric, made high to the throat, and ornamented round the hem with double trimming. Alverstoke, no stranger to the niceties of feminine apparel, saw at a glance that while this toilette was in the established mode, it was neither dashing nor expensive. No one would describe it as up to the nines, but, on the other hand, no one would stigmatise the lady as a dowd. She wore her simple dress with an air, and she was as neat as wax. She was also perfectly composed, a circumstance which made Alverstoke wonder whether she was older than he had at first supposed. Since young unmarried ladies did not commonly receive male visitors, it would have been natural for her to have been a trifle flustered by the entrance of a strange gentleman, but she seemed to be as unperturbed by this as by his cool scrutiny. So, far from blushing or lowering her eyes, she betrayed not the smallest sign of maidenly confusion, but looked him over thoughtfully, and, as he realised with amusement, extremely critically. He moved forward in his graceful, unhurried way. "Have I the honour of addressing Miss Merriville?" he inquired. She got up and came to meet him, holding out her hand.
Yes, I'm Miss Merriville. How do you do? Pray forgive me. I wasn't expecting this visit, you see.
Then pray forgive me. I was under the impression that you desired me to visit you.
Yes, but I had quite given up expecting you to call, which didn't surprise me, because I dare say you thought it a tiresome imposition, besides being perhaps much too coming.
Not at all, he murmured, at his most languid.
Well, I'm afraid it was. The thing is that from having lived all my life in Herefordshire, I am not yet perfectly acquainted with London customs.
An engaging twinkle lit her eyes. She added confidingly,
You can have no notion of how very hard it is to conform to propriety when one has been, you may say, the mistress of the house for years and years.
On the contrary, he responded promptly. I've every notion of it. She laughed.
No, have you? Then perhaps it won't be so difficult to explain to you why I solicited the favour of your visit.
What an admirable phrase, he commented. Did you commit it to memory? I thought that your solicitation was rather a summons.
Oh, dear, said Miss Merriville, stricken. And I took such pains not to appear to be a managing female.
Are you one?
Yes, but how could I help it? I must tell you how it comes about that... But pray, won't you be seated?